I'd like to interview him too, but I'll introduce him. Acting Senior Vice President of News, Chris Turpin, who will introduce the panel for our next session on the risk of reporting. So Chris, if you would come on up.
Good morning, and welcome to the final session for the weekend in Washington. I hope you've had a great time. Dinner last night, I was asked a question. The question was, what keeps me awake at night in this job? And it was actually a pretty easy question to answer, because the answer is the subject of this presentation. It's the relationship between reporting and risk. And I confess, I've been in the job about 3 months, and it took me a little bit by surprise at first, just the incredible weight of responsibility you feel as a senior news leader for the health and welfare of the people who actually work for you, especially the reporters, producers, and local staff who work in some of the most dangerous places in the world. We spend a huge amount of time thinking about risk, calibrating risk, doing everything we can to make sure that our reporters are safe. We've raised our game enormously in this area over the past few years. We have state-of-the-art equipment like body armor. We send everyone who goes to a dangerous place on hazardous training courses run by really scary former SAS, British Special Forces officers who persuade reporters to actually wear that equipment, even though it's bulky and uncomfortable at times, and teach them not to duck down behind car doors, because unlike in the movies where that's a good way of defending yourself if someone shoots at you, it's probably about the most stupid thing you can do in a dangerous place. We have a full-time security advisor who we consult on all kind of missions that involve going into dangerous or risky places. We use GPS and satellite trackers with some of our reporters, the latest technologies, so that we can keep tabs on where they are, make sure they can check in with us. We have elaborate protocols to make sure that we can put their safety first. But we can't get around one very, very basic fact, which is that risk is inherent in what we do. And I think anyone who's followed the news recently and the sad and tragic case of James Foley and others knows that reporting is a risky job. We ask our journalists to bear witness to some of the hardest stories of the day. They go to places where there's war, disease, rage, protest, all kinds of foreseen and unforeseen dangers. There's Nurit Eisenman in Monroe, Liberia, who's about to actually just head back to West Africa. Emily Harris in Gaza, in Israel, Peter Kenyon in Iraq, Sean Carberry in Afghanistan, Phil Reeves in Pakistan, and many, many, many others. These are reporters who every day are faced with literal life and death decisions. Should I visit the next village? Go round the next corner? Trust the driver who just picked me up, who I don't know? And today we're going to introduce you to reporters who've asked those questions time and time again. Jason Bovian is our global health correspondent, who's most recently been in West Africa covering the Ebola outbreak there. NPR photojournalist David Gilkey. David's also been in West Africa recently. In fact, he's about to leave again. He's also covered conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. Basically, if there's somewhere you've never wanted to go on vacation, David's been there and taken amazing pictures from there. And Elise Hu, NPR's technology and culture correspondent, who had her own tastes of the risks inherent in reporting closer to home recently when she was covering events in Ferguson, Missouri. She took us inside one of those clashes between protesters and police. Let's hear what she actually caught on tape one evening.
Those of you standing in the road by the Quick Trip, you are unlawfully assembled. You need to continue to move. If you are standing in the street or standing still, you may be subject to arrest. Please get out of the roadway and continue to move.
Ladies and gentlemen, Elise Hu.
Thank you. Thanks. funny little footnote about hostile environment training is that the week I was supposed to be, I was already signed up for hostile environment training, and the week I was supposed to be in Harrisonburg, Virginia, doing the training, I volunteered to go to Ferguson instead. So I still have to do the training, and it's coming up in a couple of weeks. What you were hearing there was one of the more tense evenings. I went down to Ferguson a couple nights before the curfew. You'll remember that Governor Jay Nixon instituted that curfew that didn't work. And then I was there for the couple of nights where the experiment with curfews kind of failed. So those were still very tense nights in Ferguson. What was really interesting about that experience was that during the day it was any suburb USA. It was quite calm. I was able to get my 4 Starbucks a day. And I was camped out in a Target parking lot because the Target parking lot was taken over by the National Guard and police from jurisdictions all over Missouri. Tim Eby from St. Louis Public Radio is here, and he and his staff were fantastic partners with us, so I always want to mention that because they were really everywhere at once, and we were able to coordinate and collaborate really well together. But it was really calm, and it was really, there was no sense that things would get tense until everything changed when the sun kind of came down. And so around 5 o'clock, 5:30 in the evening, the barricades would go up. And there was kind of a close barricade right around the 4 blocks where the most tense action was between protesters and police. On television, I felt like it was sort of abstracted because it seemed like it was the entire town of Ferguson sometimes. But really it was 4 blocks of one street, West Florissant. But then there was a wider perimeter too when the National Guard came in, and they started blocking things off maybe a mile radius around the area. And so people who worked at businesses inside couldn't get in. And if you were inside the barricades as night fell, you couldn't get out. So if you were in, you were in, and if you were out, you couldn't get in. And the night that you heard those helicopters buzzing overhead, I decided not to go in because I was reporting, I think, for All Things Considered that afternoon, and so my piece had run, and somebody else was working on the morning edition piece. But it was clear from the command center. So I was monitoring from the command center in front of the Target, and it was clear as the Humvees started rolling out that something was going on West Florissant, and that we needed to have somebody there. St. Louis Public Radio, they had been gassed the night before. I think Dury Buskarin, she had just been tear gassed the night before, and so we wouldn't have had public radio coverage kind of that evening. And so a New York Times photographer and I decided to go on foot to try and get past a barricade. What happened was the cop said, for your own safety, I can't let you pass. But if you want to go around another way, I can't stop you. And so this is how all press had to get around. So we took kind of this back way and got into the middle of the action. If you were watching CNN or Fox or any of the cable networks, you saw that all the press was kind of in one place so that you could kind of see what was happening in the background. If you went on foot and went past the barricades, you kind of had to go around, which meant we were in front of the pen and closer into the protest line. And it was kind of a place where you felt sort of exposed. And so in order to keep from feeling exposed and remain safe, I huddled with other photographers and other media. Suddenly though, and this is what happened with Ferguson, everything was very calm during the day and things would go from calm to chaos just in a flash. And that night it had actually seemed like nothing was going to happen because previous nights, when there was chaos, it would happen at 8 or 9 at night. That night it was nearly midnight before something went wrong. And what went wrong was gunshots, so familiar sounds of gunshots. And so you heard the gunshots go off, the pops of that, and then some bottles and bottles breaking because they were being thrown, according to the police. And so immediately the police deployed smoke bombs and tear gas, and it was impossible to see, and everybody was taking cover. I took cover in a car wash, which was right across the street. And there were some locals. Like I mentioned, if you were in the barricades, you were in, right? And there were some locals who were kind of just gawking, and they had been parked in the car wash. This is one of those do-it-yourself car washes. And they had been there all night. And so, and it was 2 ladies, and so they said, get in. And so I just dove into the back seat of their car, and I was in this black SUV inside the car wash feeling pretty good because the gas wasn't really affecting me as much. The rest of the press had been pushed back, and so the danger there was I was separated from the rest of the media. And what happened right after happened to be captured on tape, which I didn't see until many days after, but we have the clip for you.
And ever since then, we're watching a tactical unit going in now. So there are journalists in there. I'm sorry, a tactical unit was going in towards the car wash where some journalists sought safety. And the reason we're all hunkered down behind a concrete wall here is because moments ago we heard the unmistakable sound of gunshots.
So that was their point of view. That was mine. And this is just before the cops decided to train their guns at us. So those were the two gals, the St. Louisans, who let me dive into the backseat of their car. And so I was able to get off one shot with my iPhone before the guns came at us. So those were a couple of harrowing moments. I'm really glad that things turned out as they did, and we were able to file for newscast right afterwards. And this was really the work that was of a team. You know, I wasn't the only NPR reporter in Ferguson, and certainly we were amplified. Our efforts were amplified by the efforts of St. Louis Public Radio, which was fantastic. And now, while the dangers of Ferguson, I think, were really apparent and quite clear. There were clear barricades. You know, there was tear gas. There were guns. The danger isn't so clear in West Africa, and that's where one of the scariest outbreaks on the planet is still raging. The numbers are this. So far, more than 13,000 Ebola cases have been reported, and nearly 5,000 people have died. Jason Beaubien is NPR's global health and development correspondent. He was in West Africa several weeks ago. He's been back, and don't worry, he's out of the mandatory 21-day incubation period. Jason, I guess my question for you is, many news organizations have decided not to send reporters to West Africa. Why is it important for you to go?
Well, I mean, we saw this early on. We saw that this outbreak was happening in March, and we, expected that it was going to be like other Ebola outbreaks. We expected, there would be a certain number of people who would get infected, a certain number of people who would die. They would contain it in one area, and we expected, 3 or 4 months, this whole thing would be wrapped up with, maybe if it was bad, like 200 dead. That's what we thought this was going to be like. And early on, we sent Ophabia in. Ophabia was there in April. It came out in March that this was happening. In April, she was there. She was on the ground in Guinea. And we thought, we've pretty much got that covered, and that story is going to be put to rest. And then we started just seeing over the summer that, boy, these numbers are really remarkable, and seeing the spread of it. And so I went in July. This was before the two American missionaries got infected. It was, at this point, it really wasn't on the radar at all for other news organizations, but we could see that something was happening there. And so the first trip that I did was in July, and I went to Sierra Leone because it just really felt to us that this is not under control. And so I went on my own on that trip. That was not a trip that went with a producer or a photographer, and just flew into Sierra Leone and did my first round of reporting from there.
Before you go into a situation like this, how do you prepare yourself?
It's somewhat similar to like a disaster. David and I have covered the Haitian earthquake. We covered the typhoon in the Philippines. Whenever you're about to go on one of these, it's like this frantic getting ready, and you're running around and you're trying to get cash. You're trying to get thousands of dollars in cash, because when things go bad, nobody takes credit cards. So we're going to be carrying 6, 7, on some disasters you might be carrying $10,000 in cash, and you go to the bank, and then the bank doesn't have any hundreds, and you don't want $7,000 in 20s, and so you're like running around trying to get all these things done right before you head off on one of these trips. And it was actually on the second trip that I was going on, one thing that really struck me on the first trip was like, man, malaria was really bad, and I had enough malaria pills, but I'd used them all up during that first trip, and I kind of put off getting any more malaria pills, and I was like the day before I was leaving, and we've got this travel clinic that we work with here in DC, and I called them up, and I said, I really need some more, Cipro. I wanted some Cipro and some Malarone. And they said, oh, you never come in. You always are just calling us at the last minute. And they're like, and I'm like, you know what? I have so much to do today. And they're like, all right, but we were looking at our records. The last time you actually came in the office was 2006, and this is really not acceptable, Jason. And I'm like, yeah, but can you just fax me that prescription? And they're like, all right. So, and then at 5:30 at night, I'm driving home. The director of the travel clinic calls me up and says, you know what, we're cutting you off. You are never coming in here. And I'm like, I'm flying out tomorrow, and getting the Malarone is really important to me because I'm going to West Africa. The last thing I want to happen is to get malaria and make it, malaria looks very similar to Ebola in the early stages. I don't want to come down with malaria, end up getting thrown into isolation in some Ebola ward with all these other people who actually have it. And she's like, what about typhoid? Have you thought about typhoid? I'm like, typhoid is the least of my worries at the moment. She really did cut me off. And the next day I had to scrounge up some malaria pills from some other people at the office. So it's things like this that you do to get prepared, to go. So there's a lot of preparation that goes ahead before you even land on the ground.
And luckily, we have such a global presence of reporters that there was so much malaria, so many malaria pills in the office.
Go around
So you get to West Africa.
Yeah.
Talk to us a little bit about how you deal in a situation in which sort of the virus is all around you. You're in a place where Ebola is.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about it, people here there's a lot of people in America who are freaked out about Ebola. And so imagine when you're flying in somewhere and you're going somewhere where you know that this virus is spreading around you, and each trip it was different. The first trip didn't feel very strange in Freetown at all. The second time I flew into Freetown, there was hardly anyone on the plane, and we start to descend, and the cabin crew all put on masks and gloves. And then I noticed that everyone else on the plane is putting on masks and gloves, and it was mainly Lebanese business people who lived there. Clearly, these are people, and I don't have any masks or gloves in my hand carried on luggage. I've got some, but it's all in my checked bags. And I'm sort of looking around, and you just saw this tension as the plane sort of descended. And we came in, and then you got out. And again, usually in West Africa, people are grabbing at your bags, and people are sort of grabbing your hand, and they want to sell you things, and all of a sudden you came in, and everyone was keeping their distance. Everyone was backing away from you, and in a way that was completely unusual for West Africa. And it was the middle of the night. This plane just came in, I think it was after midnight. And in Freetown, to get from the airport over to the city, there used to be these Soviet helicopters that would fly from the airport into downtown. But after several bad crashes, those Soviet helicopters don't operate anymore. And so there's these boats that you have to take. And they're not that big. They probably hold 20, 25 people. And it's the middle of the night, and there's a bad storm and it's probably about, I don't know, I think it's 45 minutes on this boat to get across, and it's really rough, and everybody's trying to keep their distance, and then the waves are terrible, and then the water is washing onto the deck, and then people are starting to throw up. And one of the things you're supposed to be staying away from bodily fluids, and now you've got people throwing up all over the boat, and your feet are you don't know whether it's seawater or throw up, and then you just feel you almost feel like you can see the virus. And most of these people, I know these are business people who probably, have been out of the country, are probably not infected, but it really gets at you. You can just feel that this virus could be right around your feet. And, I got to the hotel, and immediately they have buckets of water where you can wash your hands and stuff, and I'm just running the water over my shoes, and it really is. It's intense being there, and it has become incredibly intense coming back as well. Just the social pressure. It's a difficult one to cover, and it's unlike covering any other disaster, any other story I've ever covered. In part because you can't see the enemy, you can't see what it is that's out there, and you don't know whether am I being exposed right at this moment or not. Even when you sort of say, there's no way I'm being exposed right now, there's this question in the back of your mind: did I do something that could have gotten me infected with the disease, which, if you get infected, you've got maybe a 50-50 chance of living. Even, seeing now, it seems like people getting flown back, that you've got a much better chance, but I'm not banking on that if I get medevaced out, I'm going to be able to survive. So.
NPR's Jason Beaubien. Thank you, Jason. Our next colleague also takes on a lot of risk to do his job. He captures the unforgettable. These are some of his images, where bombs fall, bullets fly. David Gilkey is an NPR photojournalist and video editor. You know his work from Afghanistan, Iraq, Gaza, and after natural disasters in Haiti and the Philippines. David has also covered the Ebola story, and in fact, as soon as he's done here, he actually has to get on a plane bound for Sierra Leone. So David, if you wouldn't mind, take us back to your time in Liberia a couple months ago. I want to talk about a story that really affected you. Talk to us about this image that we're seeing.
Well, this started a couple days earlier. There was a treatment facility, a holding center in Monrovia where they were bringing people with Ebola in West Point, which is a slum basically in downtown. It was overrun. Ebola, if you want to call it an Ebola riot, took place, and everybody in the treatment center was released, sent out on their own. So I was there for that. We didn't know where the kids had gone. We didn't know where the parents or anybody who was still capable of walking had left to. So it was a day or two, it was 2 days later, and we were back in West Point walking around seeing what was going on, and somebody ran up and they said, one of the escapees, it's hard to put that title on a 10-year-old boy, but one of the escapees is down on the beach. So it's still hard to talk about, came through these alleys and got down to the beach is right behind me. And this was sort of the scene that we came across. Nobody would touch him. He couldn't move. He clearly was deathly ill. We're wondering what to do. Finally, we gave our medical gloves to the people in the neighborhood so they could at least put a shirt on him. This is shortly after that. And somebody could actually touch him. Once we gave him the gloves, we gave some money to who appeared, it was a nurse, it was one of the leaders of the neighborhood, but we gave her the money and said, you've got to try to get a taxi, you've got to do something, you can't just let this little boy lay here. So we had to leave, it was getting dark. The next day, I was out at one of the hospitals, and so was the other photographer who was with me the day before, and we learned that he had died that night. So, really, in a lot of the places you go, what's happening is happening very quickly, and so scenes like this play out in Haiti, or scenes like this play out in the Philippines, and they're there and they're gone, and it's very chaotic. This seemed to be in very much like what's happening over there is in slow motion. And so, I just don't think it's very often in your career that you are totally helpless to do something about a situation like this. I think had this been somewhere else, you'd pick the child up, or you would do something, but this is just, to touch him was, putting yourself at risk, so.
How did you bring this story to our audiences?
Well, this first appeared on Instagram, I think, and then we ran it in the regular website, and then it just sort of took off from there.
And one of the shows did ask you to talk a little bit about this, right? So y'all might have heard David, is that right?
Yeah.
There
was follow-up to it.
Yeah.
On the radio.
And there were actually lots of listeners who wrote in about it, and the story resonated with them. We received a letter from one listener about that child, and I'm going to read a little bit from it. My wife is 7 weeks pregnant, and after hearing David Gilkey's story about Sa Exco, I knew that we found the name for our child. When Sa Exco passed away, no one was able to give him love, care, and protection. In honor of Sa Exco, my wife and I are going to name our first child after him and provide it with what Sa was missing so very much in the last few days of his life. How do you react to that, David, when you read that letter?
I mean, I've never had a letter or something that, look, the situation had affected me so deeply when we were dealing with it, when it was happening, that I don't want to be mistaken for what I'm going to say, but it was actually, it was heartening and made me feel good that somebody, that what we had shown had changed people's lives. It really, once again, I've just, it's very rarely that you get to connect with the listeners or the readers or the viewers, and this was a situation I got to speak to the family, and I think it put a tiny little bright spot on what was a terrible situation.
And you've covered conflict and terrorism. How is covering Ebola different than covering war, for example?
I'm going to go back to what Jason said. When you cover a war, you cover a disaster, you know where you're going. For example, in Japan, Jason and I were in Japan after the tsunami. You know you're going to this area where things are going to get really bad. In war, you know you're going to go down a road to the front line, and the people you're behind are on this side and the enemy is on the other side. This is complete 360 degrees around you. So, I mean, just to give you an example, think about everything that you've done this morning, and that's a threat. Walking down the stairs, putting your hands on the handrails. You don't know who just walked down that set of stairs and put their hands somewhere. Getting into the car, you're touching a door handle that somebody might have just gotten out of and could have been contaminated and touched it. So it's a unique situation because it's everywhere. You come back from a long day out working and you go into your hotel room, and who cleaned my room, and what did they do, and who's preparing my dinner, and so it's there's never, and then of course taking malaria pills, there's not really a good night's rest. I don't know how many of you have taken Malarone or Methaquin, but it does some crazy things to your dream world. But so it'd be nice to get a good night's sleep, but we're not getting that. But so that's the best way I can describe it. Is it's this total bubble that you're constantly being aware of the threat that's around you.
We have one more look at David's reporting from West Africa. It's in the form of this video.
The Ebola epidemic in West Africa is out of control. A major reason is corpses. Health department teams can't pick them up fast enough. It's not easy to watch. This is one of 4 body collection teams working in Liberia's capital of Monrovia. They've come to pick up a woman who lived at the bottom of this cliff. Her name is Rachel Willa. She is one of hundreds of people who have died of Ebola across West Africa. The men begin putting on their protective gear. They proceed with meticulous care. This job is extremely dangerous because dead bodies are so infectious. Their families have begged them to quit, but they say someone needs to do it. And it pays good money here, about $1,000 a month.
Because I want to say thank you. As you are volunteering, may you be the guide and may you be the protector. We are not a protector, we are a protection mentor, but we see all with the Holy Spirit and injured. Take complete control of your body in the suppression of faith. Well done, bro.
They carry a container of chlorine solution to disinfect the area. Mrs. Willa is inside, in a darkened bedroom. She and her husband, who died a few days earlier, leave behind 4 children. All of them touched her while she was sick. So did 21 other people in the neighborhood. Now many of them may be infected.
So you know it happening, you definitely have to go before yourself. I'm not doing it for your own safety.
Ready? This is as close to a funeral as she will get. Mrs. Willow was well loved in this community.
Ready? Go! Go!
Okay, go. Go. Yeah.
The team will pick up a total of 7 bodies today and take them to a crematorium. Tomorrow, they'll do it all over again.
So a huge thank you to you, David Gilkey and Jason Bobian, for all the risks you take on to bring us the story.
And a huge thanks to you, Elise, for the work, the amazing work that you do. For those who are in the room who don't know, Elise is going to be heading to Seoul soon, where we're opening a new bureau in the new year, and she's going to be our first correspondent in Seoul. We thought we'd open... We thought we'd leave the rest of the time open for questions. So if you have questions, there are obviously microphones, as you've probably realized by now, around the room, and we're happy to take questions.
I'm Doug Griswold, and my question is, when you go back to West Africa, are you going to request the vaccine?
Well, there is not a vaccine yet available. If they came up with a vaccine that had been proven safe and that they were giving to healthcare workers, I would request that as well. Yeah.
And you feel safe going over without it?
Yeah, I feel like this is a type of story that you can do it safely. You know, it's not without any risk. But I feel like there are measures you can take to keep yourself safe. And the more that I've done it, the clearer it's become to me that it's people who are extremely sick who are the most contagious. And so if you can keep yourself away from them, I feel like you can manage the risk, and it's doable to do this reporting. So, yeah.
I think if you're having to put on personal protection equipment, and you know the nickname in the business is PPE, so if you're having to put that on to go in somewhere to see something or interview someone, I think that's the line.
Yeah, and I know that you were using that during that body collectors story. I never put on the personal protective equipment, and because I don't go into the hot zones of these wards. I go to the hospital, see what the people are doing, but I don't accompany the doctors or anyone into those wards. And even if we did, we would have to throw away all of our equipment when we came out. So they wouldn't allow me to bring my equipment out. So unless I had a transmitter or something on my recorder, there's no way that I would get the audio out. So it's useless for me to go in. And you can actually see into a lot of these wards because they're mainly open tents. So you can often, from a distance, see what's going on inside them. So I always feel like you can keep your distance from it. Yeah. Yeah, next.
My name is David Hoyt. First, thank you for the wonderful presentation, but also for the risks each of you take in reporting. So from listening to these stories and a lot of the conversation, we've talked extensively about the physical risks each of you takes, but I think it's very clear that the risks aren't purely physical to one's bodily health, but also to one's psyche and psychological. So I was going to ask, how do each of you, both individually and maybe as a team in NPR, take preparations for the psychological risks you're going to face in preparation and during decompression when you come back after reporting on a story?
One thing that I didn't expect was the need to sort of decompress afterwards. So I came back from Ferguson and just like went back to work and back into my tech and culture stories, and realized a few days into that I just needed some time, you know? It was a really difficult story for lots of reasons, but also just very intense. I mean, it's draining to be working those sorts of hours. And so I didn't take that into account, and that was a huge lesson that I learned. And later, when Jason and I were actually talking about it, y'all actually, this is a little bit more codified, right? Just the rest afterwards.
Well, on the Ebola thing, we've been taking, I mean, we're not doing a 21-day sort of quarantine after it. We monitor ourselves, take our temperature twice a day, and when we get back, generally people are taking, 3, 4, 5 days off and then coming back to work. We probably don't deal with the psychological side as well as we probably should. I mean, we're all people who are driven. We want to get the stories that we've reported on the air, so you get back and you've got all these amazing stories that you still want to produce. And so I think at times you do end up pushing yourself a little bit too much, and it's part of the overall risk of doing this. That's my take on it.
I think the psychological rest that you usually get from a big assignment, whether it's war or an ongoing disaster, we're always allowed a few days of break time and flying home and sort of taking a rest. Psychologically, with this one, you don't get that rest, because in the back of your mind, you're like, well, did I touch? Did I? I mean, when you sit down at night and either watch TV or read or whatever it is that you're doing to relax, your brain, it's almost an aha moment every day. You're kind of like, oh, yeah, that could be the case. So I think it takes the 21 days to actually get the break that you need mentally.
And I mean, it's quite common after a big disaster, after Haiti or Japan or the Philippines, typhoon, you get back. I often would come home and just get incredibly sick, because you've just been keeping yourself, I'm keeping my immune system up just by sheer force of will. And then you come back on this one, you don't want to get sick. So you're like, it's actually very difficult. And, the social environment has changed completely. On this third trip that I came back from, you're not coming back to a welcoming environment. There are people who simply don't want you around. It's socially, it's really a tough one. And it's tough on your family. It's tough on my children. They have been ostracized at school over what I do. So you think about Casey Hickox, who comes back she's the nurse who came back, got quarantined at the Newark airport. We aren't actually in there treating patients day in and day out. You think about what those nurses are doing, those doctors. They have been running a ward in which half of their patients are probably dying, right? They're there trying to save people's lives. They spend 6 weeks, and then they come back, and Casey Hickox ends up in a tent over near the Newark airport. It was just I think we need to be thinking about, those are the people who are going to stop this disease. It's the Casey Hickoxes of the world who are going to stop this disease. And the way we're being treated is one thing, but the way they're being treated and might be treated, I think is incredibly concerning, not just from a personal level, from a public health perspective. Now I'm on my soapbox about this, but the only people who are going to stop this disease are the medical professionals who are willing to go over there and actually fight it on the front lines. And I think there's a lot of fear around this at the moment. But, yeah, that's my 2 cents.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Sinclair. I also want to say thank you so much for the work that you do and for sharing these moving stories. And I guess I want to ask, what motivates you? I understand that it's getting the story, but with all the risks that you have before, after, and during, what do you feel motivates you? And I think I also want to know a little bit about what you feel is your role, like when you're in the situation where you're seeing a young person that you can't help. What do you tell yourself? What do you feel like is crossing the line? And what do you feel is your responsibility?
I think it's just ultimately important to tell that story. I mean, this is something that, you know, look, between the first time that I went to Liberia and today leaving for Sierra Leone, Dallas happened, and Dallas changed everything. It absolutely petrified the United States. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I think I've been most proud of is that, at least for I can speak for NPR, is that we've taken a very scientific approach to this and said, okay, you know, these things have happened, this is what's happening in West Africa, but we're going to present this as science and not, you know, so having my piece of that photographically on the last trip and now this trip is to just say, look, here is what it looks like and here are the facts.
And it's to get the word out. On that first trip that I went in July, you know, as I said, this was before Kent Brantley and Nancy Wright Ball, with the two missionaries, American missionaries, got it and got flown back. I went over there to Sierra Leone, and it was out of control. There was this hospital in Kenema where the doctors were dying. I finally got up to a place which is north of Kenema in Sierra Leone called Kailaun, and I got there, and I'd been in touch with this WHO guy who was helping run things there, and he was dealing with the burials, and I get there, and he meets me at the hotel. He's like, "You're here, great, and you've got a 4x4. This is excellent, because I got a whole bunch of bodies that I need to bury, and I don't have a truck." And I was just like, well, we can't put the bodies in my truck. And he's like, well, you know, if I could just put my crew in your vehicle, we could go and bury the bodies. And he's like, I got all these bodies. This was in July. You've got WHO, World Health Organization people who don't even have a vehicle. And he's got all these bodies piled up. So in the end, I agreed that I would take him and one of his diggers in my vehicle, and he had to get another pickup for the other thing. But that's what was happening at that point in time. This disease was out of control, and so that motivates me. I feel like the world needed to know what was happening in Sierra Leone at that moment in time, and the world wasn't paying attention. The resources weren't there. So that's what keeps me going. Yeah.
Great. I'm Paul Haig. I also want to thank all four of you for what you do. I think Ebola, of all the issues that we've talked about in the years I've been listening to NPR, I can't think of an issue in which NPR's approach has been more necessary to inform the public policy debates. So thank you so much for what you're all doing in this area. I wanted to ask a slightly different question and ask if Elise could elaborate a little bit on the decision to open up in South Korea and about some of the things that you expect to be looking at when you go.
Sure. I really like data visualization, and there was one that came out a few weeks ago that had a circle. It was a circle around India, China, the Korean Peninsula, Japan, and a couple of the islands in Southeast Asia. And what that circle represented was half of the world's population lives in that circle. Half of the world's population. There are incredibly rich stories and important stories of geopolitical importance, economic importance, social, cultural importance that we need to be telling. I am Asian American. My father actually escaped China during the Cultural Revolution, which was, incredible story there, just in our own family. And so, I cover tech and culture. And Korea is this economy that's ascendant. It is an economy that went from agrarian and one of the poorest nations in the world to, we're talking about South Korea, of course, to one of the richest nations in the world inside of 2 generations. I mean, so what has happened there is endlessly fascinating. We're also going to use that bureau to sort of be home base for Japan coverage as well. So I'm expected to be in Japan as much as I'm in Korea. And we haven't had a bureau, like a formal NPR bureau there in more than a decade. So it's just going to be exciting. It has the fastest internet in the world. So So I'm going to push deadline a little bit more. I'm really excited to try that out and see how it works. Says my boss. So, but no, there's going to be rich stories on every front, and I'm so excited to be doing it.
Can you take one last question, and we have to wrap, I'm afraid, and we have to get back to rooms.
Thank you, Charlie Kirker. I was fascinated by your comment, Jason, and thank you to each of you. It's very moving what you have done and told us this morning. But you said it's very important that I get there to report the story for the sake of the world. And when we think about the global reach now of NPR, I'm wondering, you probably encounter and get to know reporters for other news agencies from other countries. And who else is really on the front lines like you are now in reaching the stories in the places of the world that need to be heard? And increasingly, as print media is shrinking, is it the BBC? Is it Agence French Press? Who is it that you see out there covering the stories with an objective scientific desire to get to the truth?
I mean, the New York Times is out there. They've got people all throughout the region. You know, if I just think about who I was seeing around there. I mean, early on, those first 2 trips, I was in the hotel almost all by myself. It was like, there wasn't any aid people, there weren't any other reporters.
Even when we were there, which was a month later, there was still, this was one that,
yeah, people,
it was hands off.
Yeah. But the New York Times has been covering it quite aggressively. Even the BBC isn't as aggressive on this as I would have expected them to be. You know, CNN was there the last time I was there. So, but I do think that I think we're doing a better job than a lot of the other media out there. Yeah.
And the absolutely last question.
David, during the trustee meeting on Thursday, I think it was, or Friday, whenever it was, because this has been such a long and great weekend, we saw more of the clips of your Salaska story. I don't think there was a dry eye in the room. And I've got to tell you, I'm so moved by what you do. And I think it's so important. Carol and I will be talking to Jarl later about making a small gift to directly support your health and welfare as you cover this story.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't think there's anything else I can say other than thank you all for coming, and thank you for being here this weekend.
Elise, Jason, David, I can only echo what Dick Hertzberg, one of our trustees, said. Thank you for the important work you're doing to deliver the stories that are so important for people to hear and to see in the case of your work, David. And it's wonderful that NPR has the ability to do both. So really, really appreciate your work. That concludes what has been, I think, an incredible weekend. We'd all agree. And what a note to end it on, because these are the people that are out in the field doing the work, taking the risks, and covering the news that we depend on day in and day out. Until hearing today's conversation, we may not have thought about the cost of keeping our journalists safe as they report in dangerous parts of the world, whether it be war, whether it be Ebola, whether it be natural disasters. It's inspiring to know the lengths our reporters go to keep the American public informed. This is exactly why supporting your local station, and you know we had many of our local stations here for us this weekend, with us this weekend, and NPR is more important than ever. It is you, the advocates, and I heard it over and over again, the diehard fans. I wake up to NPR, I go to bed to NPR, that have committed themselves to being listeners, who help NPR and member stations thrive, and continue their ability to deliver the journalism that we've all come to rely upon. Thank you so much for joining us this weekend. Thank you.